Good morning, everyone. We hope you've been enjoying the last few days here and your first day of orientation yesterday. This morning we have our academic freedom panel, and we're so excited for all of you to hear from our amazing panelists today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our university provost, Dr. Sunil Kumar. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for joining. I know this is perhaps your first formal event involving the entire class. And in true Hopkins fashion, we have picked a light and funny topic. No, I'm kidding. This is as serious as it gets. And because we feel that this is a good orientation to Hopkins as a place of learning, as a place of research, and a place of debate and conversation. So before I get started, I'd like to encourage you to submit any questions you may have for me or the panelists via email or text using the number listed on the screen. I think they'll put that up in just a second. It's provost@jhu.edu is the email address. And text number will be on the screen, so please do let us know. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Today's discussion is on academic freedom, one of the core values of Johns Hopkins, and one I hope each of you will come to cherish during your time here. As you waved goodbye to your mom or dad or guardian, I know some of you cracked a smile and thought, I'm free. It's a natural thought when one arrives at college, to be sure. As you'll soon discover, it's also quite profound, so pat yourself on the back. In many ways, you'll be freer here than anywhere else you will likely go. And that's because there are many freedoms, and nearly all of them converge on the university campus. Freedom from parental constraints, freedom to travel, freedom to develop your own identity, freedom to worship or not, freedom of expression, and freedom to pursue ideas wherever they may lead without undue interference. At Johns Hopkins, we value all freedoms, but academic freedom perhaps most of all. That's because without it, we could not succeed in our mission to foster independent and original research and to bring the benefits of discovery to the world. Without it, our faculty could not test new and unorthodox ideas or share knowledge with students in the world that some might find unwelcome. Academic freedom protects our professors from being persecuted for their ideas and protects our students from having their education limited by authorities who disagree. Take the past 2 years, for example. Our medical and public health experts, as well as our engineers, brought transparency and made recommendations on responding to the pandemic. This did not always sit well in various corridors of power, and the university did receive some serious pushback. But the university was unwavering on academic freedom. As long as they met the norms of their field, our faculty members were free to take any position they wished, and the university would back them. The freedom of Johns Hopkins medical and public health experts to speak candidly to leadership and to advisory committees across the country helped propel Hopkins to becoming a national leader among universities in tracking and combating the virus. Now, it's important to understand what academic freedom is and what it isn't. Understanding the distinctions helps one see the responsibilities that go hand in hand with the freedom. First, academic freedom is the freedom to follow your nose and study whatever idea pops into your head. It is not the freedom to say whatever idea pops into your head. Academic freedom is not the same as freedom of speech. And this leads to the first responsibility inherent in academic freedom, the responsibility to hold ideas to a high standard. We are America's first research university, and research requires rigor. The ideas we share must be backed up by sound evidence and argumentation. When they are not, their expression is not an exercise of academic freedom, but rather academic laziness or even ignorance. The biologist Jerry Coyne describes the distinction this way. Can a geology teacher blithely tell his students that the earth is flat? Or a European history professor that the Holocaust didn't happen? That's not academic freedom, but dereliction of duty. Second, academic freedom is the freedom to explore any idea you like. It is not the freedom to shut down any idea you don't. Indeed, the best way to advance the progress of ideas is to ensure that people whose ideas we disagree with are given a voice, provided they meet the same standards we apply to ourselves, and allow us in turn to subject their ideas to scrutiny. A few years ago, we watched an eclipse that scientists predicted down to the minute in Baltimore. Centuries earlier, scientists seeking to explain the movement of the sun and the moon were convicted of heresy. Today's heresy may become tomorrow's dogma, and today's accepted wisdom may be disproved before long. To paraphrase Baltimore's unofficial philosopher, H.L. Mencken, the profoundest truths of the Middle Ages are now laughed at by school children. And some of what we hold to be profound truths today will be laughed at a few centuries hence, even by school teachers. We have a responsibility to have all ideas get aired so that we can best discern the lasting truths among them. If we do not do this, we cannot live up to the university's motto, taken from the Gospel of John. Veritas vos liberabit, the truth shall set you free. To get there, we must first ask, quid est veritas? What is truth? From time to time, this will mean listening to ideas that we may find deeply disquieting. It is important in these moments to remember that allowing all ideas to get aired does not mean acquiescence to the content of those ideas. If anything, listening to these ideas empowers you to better interrogate their content, find flaws, and give substance to your dissent. And in these moments, remember that the university is here to support you in your journey of discovery. We cannot, and indeed should not, block disquieting ideas, but we will support you when you confront them. This leads to a third critical distinction. Academic freedom gives us free rein on how we think. It does not give free rein over how we act on our thoughts. Intimidation and harassment are unacceptable. The protests staged by white supremacists in Charlottesville near the University of Virginia in 2017 were not a showcase of academic freedom, but an act of unbridled racism and hatred designed to intimidate and inspire fear. Such acts have no place here at Hopkins, and we will dissent in the strongest possible terms from ideas that seek to turn our diversity into a source of strife. Let me close with a note on diversity, inclusion, and social justice. The full value of academic freedom can only be realized in a richly diverse environment. In a world of homogeneous people and thoughts, our assumptions will never be challenged, and new pathways of discovery will never be forged. It is only when different ideas mix and collide that we get the creative friction and discoveries that shed fresh light on old problems and get us closer to new truths. Among those old problems that we want to explore are our own past failures as an institution, particularly with respect to racial justice. Professor Martha Jones, a renowned historian in the School of Arts and Sciences, is leading an initiative to reconcile the university's history of discrimination, both overt and subtle, from its founding to its present day. Professor Jones is overseeing a number of different activities that seek to develop a more complete and textured understanding of our institutions through commissioned research, art exhibitions, student seminars, workshops, and public lectures. Academic freedom allows her and her colleagues to candidly report and discuss when we have failed as a university to uphold the principles of equality and justice, which will in turn help us to learn and do better moving forward. I hope during your time here, your many conversations with your classmates and professors will inform your thinking, broaden your horizons, and inspire you to seek new intellectual frontiers. In this regard, I hope you sign up for courses that don't just reinforce your views, but also challenge them. Seek to cultivate in yourself the ability to see things from many points of view. If you leave here without having ever had your ideas tested, then you will have missed out on one of the key gifts of a Hopkins education. Now, who better to get these many conversations started than our distinguished panelists on the stage this evening? To my left, we have Hari Hahn, Professor of Political Science and the inaugural director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute. Then we have Hilary Bach, Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Luce Professor in Bioethics and Moral and Political Theory in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and the Berman Institute of Bioethics. Then we have Minka Makalani, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Africana Studies in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. And finally, we have Hal Brands, the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs in the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. And before you ask, I'm usually asked, why isn't there somebody from the Whiting School of Engineering? I'm a professor in the Applied Math and Statistics Department in the Whiting School of Engineering. So with that, why don't I turn it over to our faculty who bring a unique perspective from their own experiences. And so let me start with the first question, which is, what does academic freedom mean to you? In particular, can you give an example from your past experience where you needed this freedom to advance your scholarship, spread knowledge, or achieve a breakthrough? So with that, over to you.
Great. Good morning. Let's try that one more time. Good morning. It's really good to see you all here. As Professor Kumar said, my name is Hari Hahn. I'm a professor in the political science department. I also direct an institute called the SNF Agora Institute that I hope all of you will get involved in. You'll hear more from us on Saturday at Democracy Day. But this morning I wanted to spend some time talking with you about this question about academic freedom and why it's so important to the work that we do at the SNF Agora Institute, but also really important to, I think, the experience that all of you are going to have as undergraduates here at Johns Hopkins University. So I wanted to kind of give you a couple illustrations of how it plays out, how it's played out in my own life, but also in the work that we do. And there are kind of 3 points that I want to leave you with through these illustrations. The first is that academic freedom is interdependent, that it's not just something a right that you have as an individual, but it's really something that we all have in relationship to each other. That's the first point. Second point is that it's not just a function of the rights that we have, but also a function of the community that we create. And that's a lot of the work that we try to do at SNF Agora. And then third is that, part of the reason why academic freedom is so important to us at the Institute, but also at Johns Hopkins, is because it allows us to pursue lines of inquiry regardless of the consequences, but also it gives us a responsibility to protect our ability to pursue those lines of inquiry. So let me give you a couple illustrations around that. So I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas. Anyone here from Texas? Ooh, a couple people. Okay, that's good. This is what happens when you come to Maryland. You don't have as many Texans as you usually do. But anyway, so I grew up in Houston, Texas, a daughter of Korean immigrants. I grew up in a community that was about 10% white, 90% non-white. It was a mix of Latino and Asian immigrants with about 25% of the people that identified as black. And my parents didn't send me to the local public school. They sent me to a Catholic school that was primarily sort of more kind of upper middle class, a largely white community. And so what that meant that growing up is I went to school in a place where linguistic and cultural differences, in some cases socioeconomic and racial differences, separated me from my classmates. And also, a lot of my classmates identified as Catholic. I was not raised in a Catholic family. And so I grew up in an environment where I had to constantly navigate and negotiate the differences between me and my classmates. And like we all do, as I'm sure many of you did when you were in high school, you just have to figure out how to make it, right? When you're a kid, you just have to figure out, like, how do you navigate those conversations on the playground, in the lunchroom, in high school, all the different things, and you have to figure it out. What no one told me at the time, but what I've come to understand now, is that I was experiencing a kind of freedom, right? The freedom to disagree. I disagree with my classmates on everything from issues of the Pope to politics, and that was okay, right? And the thing that I learned from that experience is that my freedom was dependent on their freedom, right? My freedom does not end where someone else's nose begins, but instead the idea that I could have my own beliefs and I could articulate and explore and cultivate those beliefs. Oh, so sorry. Sorry, can you guys hear me? But that, is that still working?
No, it's turned.
Oh, did I turn it around? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, maybe I'll just hold it. Anyways, but it depended on my the ability of my classmates to have that same those same freedoms, right? And so that's the way in which I think freedoms really are interdependent to each other. That our ability to hold these ideas, to cultivate our own beliefs, and then to explore them in conversation with each other and in the communities that we create is a function of all of us having that ability to do that. So that was the first thing. The second point that I wanted to make is that it kind of just brings me more to sort of the work that I do at the SNF Agora Institute. So let me just give you a little bit of background on the Institute. The SNF Agora Institute is a new institute at Johns Hopkins. We've only been around for about 3 to 4 years now. And we're called the Agora Institute because our mission is to realize the promise of the ancient agora in modern times. So for those of you who might remember from, if any of you took like classic studies or anything like that, the agora was the marketplace in ancient Athens, where the Athenians used to come together. They would go shopping. They would also engage in dialogue and discussion with each other to figure out what is the kind of city-state that we want to create, what is a democracy that we want to have. And part of the mission of the Agora Institute is to recreate the promise of that ancient agora in the 21st century. Because one of the things that we've seen is that as democracy has become challenged all over the world, that notion of the agora is being emaciated. It's been hollowed out, both in the digital and the in-person communities that we inhabit. And so part of what we're trying to do is try to figure out how can we use research and teaching and scholarship to try to understand how we can strengthen the promise of the agora throughout the world. And as part of that, we have a community in which we really cherish the kind of freedoms that come from academic freedom. And so an example that I'll give you is, we have faculty members who are both standing faculty within the SNF Agora Institute who disagree with each other in very fundamental ways. So we have one faculty member who's really dedicated her career to using survey research to trying to understand how people's political identities shape their political views and their behaviors, their orientations towards politics, their partisanship, everything like that. We have another faculty member who thinks survey research is a fundamentally flawed way of understanding political behavior. And yet they coexist in the same intellectual community because it's through that challenge that they engage with each other that we're able to hopefully improve the work that each of them can do. And we encourage that kind of challenge not only amongst our faculty, but also we want students to be challenging us and to think about and question the kind of work that we're doing. And that's something I think that is true not only at the Agora Institute, but throughout all the classes that you'll take at Hopkins. The last point that I want to make then is I think the other way that academic freedom plays out in our community is that we want to have, this is related to what the provost said, we want to be able to pursue the inquiry and the research that we do regardless of the consequences. So we have a faculty member whose work, as all faculty members do, we publish our work, and then that work goes on to take on a life of its own, and sometimes you don't know what kind of life it's going to take on. And as many of you who've been following a lot of the science around things like COVID and lots of other things have realized probably that a lot of times in the current climate that we live in, the research that we produce can become very politicized. And sometimes we don't know the ways in which it's become politicized. And so, for example, we have a faculty member whose books have been banned in certain parts of the United States because of the work that she's been doing. But part of what we feel like our responsibility is at the SNF Agora Institute is because she's been doing scholarship that really meets the highest standards of scholarly inquiry, that we vigorously protect her right to articulate and state those views. And it's those kind of protections, I think, that enable us to create the community that allows us to constantly be, investigating, discovering, learning together about the world that we inhabit, and to be able to recreate that notion of the agora. So the last thing that I'll just sort of say is that at the SNF Agora Institute, one of the things that we try really hard to do, or one of the things that we really believe is that our ability to realize the promise of the ancient agora depends first on the kind of community that we create here at Hopkins. And so in all the classes that we teach, in all the events and convenings that we engage, in all the ways in which we incorporate and create a community here on campus, we're trying to model those principles of academic freedom, of the free exchange of ideas, of this ability to sort of disagree. And we hope that we'll be able to bring all of you into it in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Hillary?
Yeah, so I think I may be briefer. I just want to say, first of all, to my mind, academic freedom is something that is important everywhere and at all times, but it is, in a sense, something that's especially important for adults. And, and it's sort of a way of treating disagreements as though we are all adults here. That said, I do agree with you that looking at your own attempts to navigate your own identity is a really useful way to think about this. I mean, I myself was not separated by ethnicity or class from my peers, but I was separated by what at least they all assured me was my deep and fundamental weirdness, right? I seem to have converged with my peers sometime in college, but for most of my childhood, I was just pronounced to be the weirdest person anyone had ever met. And when I look back on sort of trying to figure out like how to be my weird self and like what to do about this, I look back and I think, on the one hand, I'm so grateful for those people who allowed me to explore my own deep fundamental weirdness without making me feel terrible about it. People who gave me the space to explore strange ideas, and I had a bunch of views that profoundly differed from like everybody else around me because I was weird. I look back on that and I think the people who gave me the space to do this, I am grateful to them to this day. The people who just tried to shut me down, I don't like them to this day, because like little junior high school me holds grudges, sad to say. And I just think, thinking about that and thinking about who it is that you're grateful to, when you look back on your junior high school and high school years, who it is that gave you the space to try to be the person you are, and who it is that you really wish had chosen a different way, can help you to see sort of how you should respond to people that you disagree with here. That said, I need academic freedom every day of my professional career. As was noted, I teach, among other things, bioethics. In teaching bioethics, I'm always teaching controversial topics, right? You can't teach bioethics without teaching things like physician-assisted suicide, how should you allocate COVID vaccines when they're in short supply, and of course, such fascinating topics as abortion. Now, in teaching this, so first of all, if I were going to try to avoid controversial topics in my teaching, I would just like show up with a sign saying, I'm sorry, I can't say anything at the beginning of the semester, and just sit there with that sign for an entire semester, and everybody would be incredibly bored and no one would learn anything. So I have no choice, I had a choice about whether or not to do this in the first place, but I have no choice but to engage deeply controversial topics. I try to make it clear to my students, and I will try to make this briefly clear now, that when we disagree with these things, we don't have to be hostile to the people that we disagree with, obviously. Because at least to me, if I don't understand why I think something, then I don't really understand my views. If I want to be fully committed to my views, I want to understand them as completely as I possibly can, right? And it's very hard to do that if you don't encounter anybody who disagrees with you, because, you all may have infinite imaginations, but I myself do not, right? So I can think of some objections to my views, but I think of many more when other people walk up to me and say, Professor Bach, here I have a very cogent and thoughtful objection to your view. And I say, wow, this is an objection I have never thought of. And then I really learn something. And in trying to work out, like suppose it's an objection that on reflection I think is not a good one, I come away richer from having explained why, because I now understand an aspect of why I believe what I do that I didn't understand before. So when people come up to me with objections to my views, I'm like, they're doing me a great, great favor. So first of all, I try to encourage students to see that when they disagree with me, they are doing me a great favor, and to try, hopefully, to model to them, having this attitude towards people they disagree with. I also, though, think it's important to bear in mind what Provost Kumar said earlier, which is that freedom is not license. So when I teach bioethics, like say when I teach abortion, I am always mindful that, statistically speaking, it's likely that somebody in my class will be dealing with a topic like abortion in a personal way, whether because they themselves are facing the question whether to have one, or because they are the significant other of someone who's facing the question whether to have one, or because they have a friend or relative. One way or another, it seems to me, first, it's likely, but secondly, it would be a good thing for me to act as if it was likely that somebody is going to be in my audience, because there's like 200 people in that class. Somebody is going to be in that audience for whom this is not a theoretical issue. And while I would not be doing my job if I did not present arguments pro and con, and considerations that lead you to think that abortion is permissible and considerations that might lead you to think that it's not permissible, right? It's not my job to shy away from controversy. It is absolutely my job to try to present those controversies in such a way as not to cause needless, gratuitous pain to anybody who is in a situation in which it would be easier than usual for me to cause that pain. And so I think, that's something that everybody should bear in mind when they're having discussions all the time, that you do not know where other people are coming from, and you do not know what they are going through, possibly with the exception of your very closest friends. And at any rate, this is something that I try to bear in mind, and that makes me think that, while it is, again, part of my job to engage controversial issues and to discuss them, sort of giving full rein to views that I disagree with, it is not part of my job to do so in a sort of airy, dismissive, needlessly callous fashion, right? I can be empathetic and tough-minded at the same time. Whether or not I actually do this, I have no idea, but certainly it seems to me it is possible for someone to do this. I guess the last thing I want to say is, if you were ever tempted to shut down an argument, bear in mind that there are views that, there may be some view somewhere that has only one adherent, and that adherent is unbelievably wise, but most views that have at least some appreciable number of adherents, at some point or another, those adherents will say some stupid thing, which they will subsequently regret. Why? Because we are human and fallible, and sometimes we are silly. And so there is no guarantee. I mean, I think one doesn't have to go back to the Middle Ages to find, though it's a great example, to find cases where people that I deeply agree with, movements that I am deeply committed to, have periodically held views, or some appreciable number of them have held views that are silly. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when I'm picking now on feminism just because it's a view that I'm committed to, and so it would be too easy and kind of cheating for me to pick opponents. But there was a time when there was a corner of radical feminism in which it was absolutely taken for granted that if you were a real serious feminist, you also had to be a lesbian. Now, you may imagine the number of poor people trying to talk themselves into a sexual orientation that not all of them actually had. It would have been much better had people felt free to say, wait, we think this might be one of those things that in retrospect will look very silly, as in fact was true, at least in my view. So, but at the time, that would have been taken as a sort of anti-feminist thing to say in, again, certain corners of feminism. The point of this is just to say, every single movement, including the ones you are most deeply committed to, again, if it has more than one very wise follower, will have people who occasionally say silly things. It is good for that movement and good for you personally and good for other people if you act as quickly as possible to identify those mistakes when they're made and to try to correct them, because nobody should be saying silly things. It's better for everybody if everyone is completely wise. So you can't assume that just because something is something that you're deeply committed to, all the things that are said in its name are true and wise. I mean, this of course should be obvious, but it's just something that the older I get, the truer it seems. People are fallible and sometimes silly. That includes me. It may not include you. For all I know, you all may be omniscient and perfectly wise and wonderful. Probably you are, but maybe it includes at least some of you. So the point of this is just, this is how we deal with error, our own error, is to listen to other people and to really take what they say seriously and try to learn from them. And that is basically all I have to say. But,
Thank you, Hillary. Now I'll turn to Mink.
What is this? Good morning. Good morning. All right.
Mink is
Still
in the
waking
middle
up.
of moving houses, so he doesn't know if he's coming or going.
My name is Minka Makalani, and I am the director of the Center for Africana Studies, which is the hub of what's generally understood as Black studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I think the question of academic freedom, particularly if you are in any way interested in the range of things that would fall up under the rubric of Africana studies, is really important given the range of attacks that are going on across the country, particularly in places like Florida, Texas, where I just left last year, where I taught at the University of Texas, my home state of Missouri, where there's a sense that, with critical race theory, we are indoctrinating people, and it's filtered down to high schools. And so now you're here at this private institution, and we presumably can do what we want to do, and we're going to indoctrinate you when you take our classes. So this is patently untrue. It has no basis in reality. But I want to just give a little bit of a story to kind of get a sense of some of the real fallacy of this. So at my first year in college, I thought I was going to make it into the NFL, and I didn't have good grades, and this was a time when if you didn't have good grades, you couldn't go to a D1 school. So I went to a small Black college in Ohio, Central State University, and realized that, no, I didn't get that D1 scholarship because I'm just not that good, not because I didn't have good grades. And so I decided to get serious about school. And then the next year, I transferred to the University of Missouri, Columbia. And going from an all-Black college to maybe, less than 1% of the students were non-Black, to the University of Missouri, where maybe 3% of the students were Black, it was a bit of a shock. And I decided to take a course on the civil rights and Black power movement from a professor that everyone had talked really glowingly of during orientation. And so the first day in class, the professor is talking, and he says something that really jarred me, and I almost dropped the class. And he said, now you're gonna get a lot of stuff in this class that is new that you aren't aware of, but no matter where you are, where you come from, what your ideas are, you can pass this class. You could be a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan, and you can get an A in my class. And I was like, all right, this dude is crazy. The next breath, if you agree with me, you are more likely to fail my class than if you agree with me. So I just thought this was bizarre. But I went to his office hours to talk to him, and his point was very simple. Just because you agree with me doesn't mean you've done the work of study. You've done the intellectual and academic work to succeed. If you agree with me, you have to demonstrate that you agree with me. Someone who I am fundamentally opposed to can come into the classroom, do the work, and succeed if they are making rational, reasonable arguments. Now, he didn't mean that someone could come into the classroom and say, Black people are genetically, mentally, morally inferior to whites, and they should be dominated and enslaved. He did not mean that. He meant simply that if they could construct an argument that was intellectually valid, they could then defend that argument, and he would engage them. Now, the irony is that in his class, and that wasn't the only one I took, and in all the Black Studies classes that I took as an undergraduate, I got challenged nearly every day that I was in the classroom. Every idea I had, everything I said, they pushed at, they pulled at, they critiqued. They would not let us, anybody in the classroom, They never let us just simply say what was in our head and then that be it. We had to defend it. If it was reading a novel or a history text, we had to actually provide evidence from the work that we were talking about to prove to substantiate what we were saying. And these classes led to me questioning so many things that I just assumed were valid. I began to question my religious beliefs in a class on Black religion. I began to question the way that it had been taught to me, the Bible had been taught. I went to Catholic school, I was raised Baptist, and then my family became Pentecostal by the time I entered high school. And that class really helped me think differently and critically about all of these things. And then one example I'll give, which I think to me really captures what is so important about academic freedom, not the freedom to say whatever you want to say and not be challenged. That's coddling. The freedom to say what you want to say, and then the responsibility to engage with someone who questions what you've just said. And so the example is this. I grew up in the 1980s. I loved hip hop, and I kind of didn't question all the things that came along with hip hop, in particular the sexism. It just didn't occur to me that this was that big of an issue, right? I decided to take a class in my junior year on Black feminism, and the woman teaching the class, who's still a good friend to this day, made a comment about a writer from the Black arts movement in the 1960s. And I won't say their name because they passed away, and it wouldn't be fair to them in this example. But they said, oh, their plays were very sexist. And I was like, well, no, they actually have disagreed with some of the stuff that they've written, and so you can't say that they're sexist. Well, why not? You can look at their plays, you can see the depiction of Black women. This is patently sexist. I was like, no, it's not. And I just, refused to let it go. I was like a dog with a bone, and I wasn't going to drop it. And so the professor said, okay, we'll pick this up. This is the end of class. We'll pick this up the next session. So the next class, now mind you, she didn't shut me down, and I was totally wrong. She did not shut me down, but she would not let me just state it and move on. She actually made me defend it, but this is what she did. She brought in an act from the play, and she had me read the role of the man, and then she read the role of the woman. I hadn't read the play. I hadn't read any of his plays. I just was defending him because I liked his poetry, right? So I was being lazy, intellectually lazy in that argument. And so I began to read the part, and then the character that I'm reading had to beat the woman that he was talking to. And she was like, now don't beat me, but act as if you're hitting me, act it out. And I didn't want to, because at this point, I felt utterly stupid. Like I was making some argument, I had no idea what I was talking about, and she was demonstrating to me, and it was in front of the classroom, that you have to know what you're talking about. Don't just say something because it seems good or something that you've held dear, but actually know what you're talking about. Study, come prepared, and be prepared to defend those ideas. Now, from that experience, I went and read all the guys' plays, and I was like, all right, so I was way off base with my defense of him from being sexist. But the more important thing is that the rest of that class, the rest of that semester, I made sure that I read everything that I could from any Black feminist in the same time period that he was writing from the Black arts movement. This is Audre Lorde, Barbara Christian, a number of names that you might not have heard of, that I had never heard of coming out of high school, but that are really important figures and really important thinkers. And I say all this to say that when I think of Black studies, when I think of Africana studies, and my own experience, it is a project, it is a discipline and a field where I was able to come in and say some pretty uninformed stuff, to explore some ideas that were loosely formed, had some reasonable aspects to them, but I was still trying to figure everything out as an undergraduate, the same age that you are. And it was in that environment that I was pushed, I was forced to think, I was forced to work, to do research, to sharpen my ideas, and to make sure that I was thinking about all the different elements of an argument that I made. And these are lessons that I got as an undergraduate that I still carry with me today. And the final thing I'll say, and I think this is probably one of the most critical things about Africana Studies, and I think that you would find this in any of the Africana Studies classes that you would take at Hopkins, that one of the most important things for any intellectual, for any scholar, is to always question themselves. And I think this is something that you've heard stated already. But to always be willing to question what you're doing, to always be willing to hear someone question your argument, and to never assume that you have an answer to anything. And so in this respect, I think for me and for those scholars and intellectuals who are the ones that I look to, the ones that I read, the ones that I listen to, they are never the people who come to me or who come to their audience with answers to problems. Now, this is different if you're in the sciences where you might actually need to solve a problem. But in the social sciences and humanities, people who come and they say, I have the answer to this problem. I have the answer to racial oppression. I have the answer to police violence. I have the answer to X, Y, or Z. That generally is someone that I tend to pay less attention to. People that I really look to, that I read and learn from to this day, are the people who continually ask questions and are willing to admit when they were wrong, when they had the wrong idea or they didn't fully understand something, and they had the maturity and the integrity to say, I've changed my ideas around this, and I'm continuing to question this particular problem. I'm continuing to try and understand what this problem is. And they're never coming up with the answer, because at the time that you come up with the answer, then the next step is to make everyone fall in line with you and agree with you. And that isn't the job of an intellectual. That isn't the job of academic freedom. That isn't what academic freedom is about. It's about questioning and engaging your ideas and engaging your peers. And if you allow that, then whatever idea you bring to a classroom, now there might be some that are just patently wrong, and you will get told. But if you come to the classroom with an idea, you come to a professor with an idea, or you come to your peers with an idea, and they challenge that idea, that's what you want. You don't want to just have an idea, whatever it is, and it be accepted. You want to have an idea, and it be questioned, and it be challenged. And I think this is, for me, and I've been in the profession for 20 years now, as a graduate student about 26 years, questioning and really challenging your ideas and making sure you develop and sharpen what you have to say, how you think, and the research you're doing. This is the hallmark of Africana Studies. And I think it's the hallmark of so much of what I've seen in Hopkins so far. And I would just encourage you to look to Africana Studies as one of those areas where you can engage these questions.
Thank you, Minka. Appreciate it very much. And now I'll turn to Hal for the opening.
Great. Well, thank you, and I've really enjoyed hearing everybody's comments. I'm going to go really quick here. I just have two points to make. One is a point about why academic freedom is important to me personally, and the second is an example that I think will illuminate some of this stuff. And so just by way of background, I teach courses in international affairs and history, but I don't teach lecture courses for the most part. I teach seminars, and of course the whole point of a seminar is not simply that you're learning from me or whoever the professor is, it's that you're learning from your peers as well. And that obviously requires vigorous debate, right? Vigorous debate of controversial issues, vigorous debate of issues where we still may be trying to figure out what the answer is 80 years after something happened. So a question like, was it ethical to drop the atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, and why did the United States do it? There's no consensus on these issues 77 years after the fact. And so the only way you can learn about these issues is to really engage in this robust debate. And what that requires is that people feel free to express their views, and I'm going to get to what constitutes a sort of a legitimate view in a second, but they have to be able to express those views without fear of being shut down, without fear of being ostracized or censured for those views. If you can't have that, you're going to have a really boring seminar. You won't learn anything. And if you want to play for the intellectual A team over the course of your life, you've got to constantly be tested and prodded in the ways that my colleagues have talked about. There's a responsibility that comes with that, though. And the responsibility, the way I like to think of it, is that you have to, in order to engage in a debate like this, you've got to make good faith arguments that are based on evidence and analysis. And so academic freedom is not just having the ability to say outrageous things for the pleasure of pissing people off, right? It's the freedom to make arguments based on analytical premises, based on the empirical material that is available to you, no matter where those arguments take you. And as long as you're playing by those ground rules, those I think are the fundamental ground rules of academic freedom, then you have to be free to express yourself without being fearful of being shut down. And this brings me to the anecdote. And so about 3 years ago, I run a speaker series here that brings people who have often done interesting things in U.S. foreign policy to campus to talk to students. And one of the speakers we had was a man named Michael Morrell, who had been the second in command at the CIA for a number of years. And you won't be shocked to hear that if you hold a high-ranking position at the CIA, you may from time to time be engaged in things that will be considered controversial. And one of the things that he had been engaged in and then had written a very thoughtful book that dealt in part with was the question of torture, of enhanced interrogation procedures after 9/11. And because he had been out there in public making an argument, which was in a way a defense of torture, but one that acknowledged all of the moral downsides and all of the practical downsides that came with it. It was a fairly sophisticated argument. There was a group of protesters who showed up at the event and for about 20 minutes wouldn't let him speak, right? Would yell over him whenever he tried to talk, essentially would not let the event go on. And after a while, the room basically had to be cleared by the police, and some of the students who were engaged in that action subsequently faced disciplinary procedures from the university. The problem wasn't that they thought torture was bad, right? The problem wasn't that they disagreed with the speaker. They were free to come and express their disagreement with the speaker. They were free to come and ask questions. They were free to come and state that disagreement. Had they come and protested for a couple of minutes and then walked out or then allowed the event to proceed, everything would have been fine. Where it crossed the line was in preventing a different viewpoint from being expressed, and here was the really bad part, preventing the other people, their fellow students, from being exposed to a viewpoint that would have sharpened their understanding of an issue, even if they came away vehemently disagreeing with the viewpoint that he had expressed. And so that was where I think the line was crossed in that particular situation. And it just brings me back to sort of the fundamental point that I think is true for me, and I think that so many people have expressed in their comments here, which is that if you are afraid of engaging in that really kind of no-holds-barred intellectual debate, and debate can be polite, even when it's very robust, and that has to be the case. If you're afraid of engaging in that or you're not willing to engage in that, you're not abiding by the principles of academic freedom. And frankly, you're not conducting yourself in a way that's going to allow you to get the most out of your time at Hopkins. Well, this is one of the greatest intellectual opportunities that you will have to learn, to be challenged, and to grow intellectually. And I hope very much that you will take advantage of it.
Thank you, Hal. And now I'll turn to the questions you've sent, and I'll start them in an order that I think will lead to the right flow. And there's one question that I think is addressed to me that I will get to at the end. But the first one is a very important question, which is, do we have the responsibility to consider the validity of the thought or how a thought will be perceived in the future when we express it? This is an important point. The future is a dangerous business to be in because norms change. Over the summer, I have come to a personal conclusion of mine. I'm pissed off at Descartes. I'm now 370 years too late, but I am now completely angry with him. And the reason is I feel that he has reduced wisdom to logic. in some fundamental way. Now, Hillary will tell me as a professional philosopher that I'm talking through my hat, and we can have a discussion about that, but that's not the point of the comment that I made. It is that in the future, there will be people who, from their own lenses, will view your work or what you have said and may disagree with you, and that you cannot control. But at the time when you express the thought, I think Minka said it best. Don't express a thought that you're not willing to fully engage in on debate. Don't express a thought which the old Pythagoreans used to say, ipse dixit. He said it so, and therefore, or I said so, and therefore that's it. Because I said so is not an acceptable argument. And that, I think, is the one you should have in mind, rather than validity, because validity are difficult things to establish in the present, let alone in the future. With that, I'll turn to Hillary.
Yeah, so first, briefly about Descartes. It is useful, I think, to think about Descartes' meditations as part of a tradition of meditations that are designed to purify your soul. Right. I think the title was chosen for that reason, in part, and that it's actually quite interesting when you think of it that way. Leaving that to one side, yeah, predicting the future is very difficult. If you think about, like, there are all kinds of people who have thought that their views would be vindicated in the future. Nazis, for example, thought that their views would be vindicated in the future. Stalinists thought that their views would be vindicated in the future by the successful creation of the exploitation-free workers' state. These are things that did not happen, at least in my judgment, and I think that people who held those views, were they to be transported magically into our present, would look back and go, my God, what was I thinking? You can never, I think, avoid the possibility that that's going to happen, but you can ask yourself questions like, okay, so I seem to myself to be on the right side. Are the means that I'm using to advance the right side something like genocide, purges, sending people to Siberia on a regular basis? Or are they things like open-mindedness, generosity, and compassion? I think that you are much more likely to have views that survive in the long term if you are careful not only about concluding that you think your ends are justified, but also thinking about the means that you're using in order to achieve them. And not just assuming that because you have some long-term goal that you think is awesome, that absolutely anything can be justified in the service of that. Again, this is partly because, as I said before, we are fallible. We make mistakes. We want to correct them, and the best way of correcting them is for other people to feel free to tell us, I really disagree with you, here's a respectful argument about why, and us feeling as though it's our responsibility to try to answer those arguments.
Thank you, Hillary. Very well put. The next question, I'll read it out in its entirety. It's very well worded. Universities in America have fostered a reputation for having a predominantly leftist liberal student body. How should conservative and libertarian students navigate such an environment, especially in the midst of cancel culture and the willingness of partisans to dehumanize people based on their politics? Would any of you want to take that?
I can start.
Okay.
So this is a topic that I think in large part was part of what motivated the creation of the Ethnographical Institute, because at Johns Hopkins we want to create an environment where we would vigorously protect the range of views that students and faculty and anyone else who is part of our community could hold. It is true if you just look at the data that college students do tend to be more left than right, but that doesn't mean if you have students and people and speakers who are providing these kind of reasoned arguments that my colleagues have spoken about, that they should not be equally protected and explored and intellectually investigated in the classroom. And so, I think that this goes back to the point that we were making before, which is that the protection of academic freedom is a responsibility that we all have, and it's a function not just of the provost saying, hey, you have this right, but it's a function of our ability to create a community in which people who hold political views that we might disagree with are able to articulate those views, that we can bring in speakers who hold positions that we may or may not agree with, and that we can investigate, interrogate, and engage with those views in the kind of thoughtful, not ad hominem kind of way that our colleagues have thought about. And so, one of the things that we think a lot about at Agora in cultivating the kind of speakers and events and classes that we teach is thinking about how can we expose students to the range of different kinds of views that people might hold, and how do we interrogate the validity of those kinds of positions. On cancel culture, the one point that I want to add there is that, one of the things that we have talked about and done some trainings around over the past year, I think it was last year that we did it, is the idea that when you encounter speakers or views that you disagree with, the idea is not so much to cancel people, but instead to sort of call them in. How can we call people into a reasoned discussion and debate around the places where we disagree? And I think creating a community in which that is possible is part of the responsibility that we have as faculty, but also part of the role that you all can play as students and members of that community.
I would just add to this. I think one of the things that students can do is that might be very helpful is to not approach your own views or not approach those views that you encounter and try to categorize them cleanly, and so that you then make sense of everything someone says, and they're liberal, they're conservative, and that kind of gives you a sense of the value of their ideas, whether or not you should engage with them. I think it's probably much more helpful and much more fruitful if you take what someone is saying or take someone that you're reading on a point-by-point basis. Is there validity in this point that they're making, even if their ultimate conclusion is something you might not agree with? And I think that ends up being much more productive than trying to determine whether or not someone is liberal conservative or radical revolutionary or what have you, because you oftentimes are just looking for, in those instances, you're looking for someone to validate a certain set of assumptions that you have, and you aren't really, like someone you agree with might have a general good point, but a lot of the elements to that argument might not be elements that you want to follow, right? And so it's always important to really take into consideration the range of what someone is saying, even if it's something that you feel fundamentally opposed to for any range of reasons. And I think this is the problem that at least I have with the dialogue around cancel culture, both as it emerged and I think as it continues to go on. Oftentimes it's used to try and say there are these attacks on people who have conservative or less than liberal views, and that they then suffer these extreme consequences. Now, I'm not talking about what might happen on social media in different networks. I think that's a totally different kind of beast, and there's no way to really talk about how that changes. I think those things go as they go. But if we look at what happens on university campuses, at least, I've yet to hear of a conservative or libertarian professor being fired because of their political views. I do know of a person who led a grant to work with prisons in Mississippi through the University of Mississippi to address basically the carceral state, this mass system that is funneling black men and increasingly black women into the prison system. And in the context of making his point about the prison industrial complex and how it looks in Mississippi in particular, he pointed out the way that certain donors had insisted on perpetuating racist imagery and certain structures at the University of Mississippi which were detrimental to black students. That person was fired, and there wasn't anything else that went into it. So those kinds of things, I think, are what we need to really be concerned with. Who are the people who are actually being fired, who are losing their jobs, who are losing their ability to earn a living and support their families? That's different than if you feel that the environment you're in is not conducive, which isn't to say that's not important, But if you are allowed to engage with one another and question each other's ideas and arguments, I think that becomes much more fruitful. And to focus on cancel culture, if you're coming in constantly saying something, what was it, George Floyd, what's this woman, Candace Owens, made some point about George Floyd and his past criminal record after we had this long video of him being murdered. That is probably not the best place to make that point. It may be a point that you can bring up in a different kind of context, but to talk about the murder of someone and then to try and justify it, I think those are the things that get into the realm of what is cancel culture and what is just being provocative for provocative sake, but that isn't necessarily the same thing as the kinds of ideas that one brings to a discussion and how we then engage those ideas without necessarily labeling them as left, conservative, or center.
Yeah, so maybe I can add a little bit before I turn to the others on the panel. Hillary, I'll turn it over to you as well, because the consequence that I have three questions, all which I'll try to combine into one, which is, how do we distinguish between unintentional and malicious, and thought-provoking versus merely provocative and intended to incite harm? Right? How do we draw this line? And so maybe that's where you were going, Hillary, but...
I can go there. So I think, well, the first thing I really want to say is just that it's very hard to know where somebody else is coming from. So have any of you read the book, I think it's Education by Tara Westover, which I would have remembered the name had I known I was going to be bringing it up. So this is a story of a woman who was homeschooled, I think it's probably quickest and best to say, homeschooled by crazy people who basically also didn't bother to really teach her much of anything. So she managed somehow, through sheer force of will, to get herself to college, which is extraordinary in its own right. I totally recommend this book. It is really great. Anyway, she gets to college and she's taking a class, and I can't even remember what, but she hears this word that she has never heard before. And it just doesn't make any sense to her, but it seems to be important. So she raises her hand and said, "What does Holocaust mean?" And like there's this silence, and then somebody says, "You're not supposed to joke about that." But the thing is, she's actually never heard the word before. She really is just confused because people are talking about this Holocaust, and she doesn't know what that means. The point of this anecdote for me is, even in a case like that, you might think that it would be a pretty good assumption that if somebody in a university class says, "What does Holocaust mean?" or "What is this Holocaust that you are talking about?" they'd have to be kidding, right? This would have to be some sort of really terrible idea of a joke. But there is an actual human being who was baffled by this and didn't know what it meant. And then she says she went back and looked it up and was absolutely aghast, and also wondered why she'd never heard of this during all her, alleged schooling by her insane survivalist parents. The point of this is you never know unless, again, you're dealing with a close friend or somebody that you know enough about this particular person. You can't generally, sometimes you can read off that somebody is being malevolent, but it's not easy. And so I think, at least I have always wanted people to approach me with some sort of generosity, at least the generosity that says, if you don't know me, try assuming that I might just be being an idiot as opposed to a malicious, malevolent, bad person. And so I feel like, since I want to be approached that way myself, I try to approach other people in this same way and say, right, one of you, it often happens that I have students who say things that I think are not as well thought out as they might be. But I tend to assume that they are not just trying to be but they just, they're trying their best and I should engage with them. I don't know if that helped at all, but I feel like when in doubt, be generous is always a good motto.
So I guess I would just say that unintentionally offending people is part of being human,
Yep.
right? And it happens all the time, and it will undoubtedly happen to you because you're moving on to a new part of your life. There's going to be lots of new experiences, new material, new people that you haven't encountered before. And so you obviously don't want to offend people unintentionally, and there are ways that you can mitigate the danger of doing that. But it's going to happen, and part of learning how to deal with this is just that you learn as you go, and you learn as you accumulate more life experience. I mean, I think there are a handful of kind of intellectual ground rules that it's useful to keep in mind so that you're not doing this more than you intend. And so it's always useful to, think about how is this argument going to sound to someone who believes the opposite? Will it sound like I'm engaging their views respectfully and thoughtfully, or will it sound like I'm attacking them even though that's not my intention, right? How would this argument sound to someone who has in their past experience brushed up against one of these issues in a way that may make them particularly sensitive to what I'm about to say in the way that Hillary mentioned? And most important of all, right, can I defend what I'm about to say intellectually, right? If I am pushed on it, can I engage in a conversation where drawing on evidence, right, drawing on good standards of argumentation, I can explain what I think and why? If the answer to that question is yes, then I think you've mostly done your job in terms of academic freedom. You should be guided by all the rules of good conduct and polite society that we should all be guided by. But as long as you're making an intellectually defensible argument, then really I think it becomes our job to ensure that there's a climate where that can be done.
Yeah, go ahead, Harry.
The one thing I would add too is on this, I think, so I would agree with the points that have all been made, and I think the standard of arguing in good faith is one that has to be negotiated, right? There's no clear line that we can tell you, which is this is good faith and this argument's in bad faith. But a question that we think about sometimes, this idea of, am I open to being wrong, right? And often what we find in the world of politics, for example, is that people that are driven by an ideology, they're not actually open to being wrong. There's no argument that you could make that would sort of help disprove the point they're making. But if you're actually engaging in a discussion, even if you don't have all the answers worked out, if you're open to being wrong and to being to learn, I think that's the kind of argument that we're thinking about as being one that's conducted in good faith.
Go ahead.
And I just want to add, I think that there have been arguments I've been engaged in where I was not actually open to being wrong. I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to detail them, but arguments where, I feel like, for example, were I to get into an argument with a Nazi, an actual Nazi, I feel like, well, I'm not that open really to the idea of being wrong on that one, actually. I am open to the idea of being wrong about a lot of the features of my particular argument against that position, but I think it's really important, even in a case like that where you're actually you don't really envisage the possibility of being wrong, that you're open to listening very seriously to the argument, because there's almost no argument that somebody who has a view that you find abhorrent can make, that it's impossible for you to learn anything from. Right? Even things like, I wonder how an otherwise sane person, apparently sane, could believe this horrible thing. You can learn really useful things, like what's driving them to this view, what seems to be motivating them. You can learn all of those things if you stop to listen, even in a case in which, I always try to say, to students, if you come up with an argument that the correct moral theory is that you should maximize the number of ping pong balls in the world, and you give a good argument for it, I'm open to that. If I really were being completely honest, I'm like, actually, I have a very hard time imagining that that's going to happen, right? Ping pong balls, no. I'm a little open to that. I'm technically, theoretically open to that, but I don't actually think of that as a live option. But I think it's important for me to read any essay that anybody might submit to me about how ping pong balls are in fact the most important thing in the world, honestly and earnestly, as if I was open to being persuaded. And, really in some sense to think, yeah, well, they could come up with the world's best argument that is news to me, and then I would be persuaded by it. But even if I'm not open in that sense to being persuaded by something, there's almost never a case in which you have nothing to learn by listening to somebody's argument for a view that you deeply disagree with.
So I want to shift gears in the last 4 minutes we have and talk about kind of the pragmatic side of this. And one question is, if we hold academic freedom to such high importance, what resources do we have? And one thing I do want to volunteer on behalf of the faculty is the faculty. They will always be open to deep and involved conversation. And there was another question about modality. Should we do this in class or do it elsewhere? Maybe I open that up to you all. So you brought up a beautiful example of being almost disruptive in class because your mind was made up only to perhaps make the class better for everybody. So, but how do you feel about doing this in class versus doing it privately, et cetera, when you're strongly disagreeing? Yeah.
Just briefly, I'm always happy to talk to students in office hours or via email if there's a subject that they're interested in, but don't think the class is the right place to pick it up. That's fine. I will say there's no substitute for doing it in class, right? Because the audience isn't just me. The audience is the other students who are there to learn from you just as you are there to learn from them. And so as long as we can do it in a productive and respectful fashion, there's no substitute for having these tough discussions in class where other people can learn from the questions that you have as well.
So Hal, there's a specific question for you. What's the seminar series that you alluded to?
So this is, it's called the America and the World Speaker Series, and it happens mostly in the spring because that's when I teach a course up here as opposed to down in DC, and there will be more information coming on that in a few weeks.
The one other thing I'd like to say, and as I get older, I realize I talk a lot. I apologize. So, is the other additional resource for academic freedom is you all. Hari, in her initial framing, said it's not an individual right as much as also a collective norm. And I think that is something that you should not forget. If you won't engage in debate in class, in Hal's class, it will be a lesser class. And it's not just because of the professor. So I think the faculty are nodding. For me, it would be a lost opportunity if you didn't engage. So you are the other additional resource. I know I'm turning it back on you. In the last 2 minutes, I do want to address a well-written question. I'll read it out in full and then address it. This was addressed to me, I think. In his farewell address in 1961, Eisenhower warned not only of the rise of the military-industrial complex, but of the rise of the military government scientific complex. He said the prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocation, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. In case you were wondering, Eisenhower was a Republican. This is not a standard left-wing critique. Furthermore, the question goes to say, to me, it seems his warnings have unfortunately been realized in many places, including here at Johns Hopkins. This seems like a serious breach of academic freedom. The questions are, is Eisenhower's warning pertinent, and is it really here and at JHO, and if so, what can be done about it? The warning is pertinent. Right? This, as the provost, chief academic officer of the university, I take the freedom of my faculty to follow their nose extremely seriously. And if the sources of funding were to dictate what they studied, but more importantly, their conclusions, then we as a university would have failed. So this is something we worry about all the time. That said, an extremely small fraction of our faculty are actually doing work where they're not simply already telling the government what they're willing to do and getting funded for it. That is, their freedom is guaranteed up front. There is a small number of people who do work where that is not true, but those people have chosen to do so. For the average faculty member and anything that counts towards their promotion, et cetera, this work must have been done freely and should be in the public domain and available for everybody. So it is something I sweat, and indeed this is a warning that our freedoms have to be maintained even against budgetary pressure. So thank you for that question. It was very well founded. So on the note of not seeking applause twice, I will consider that the audience telling us to get off stage. So with that, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful session.